I wanted to tell you about a free online class I'm offering on treating autoimmune disease naturally with functional medicine. It's taking place on Thursday, October 28th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, and I'll be covering topics like the underlying causes of autoimmunity and how to address them, why most conventional treatments for autoimmune disease fail and can actually put your health at risk, the most common myths and misconceptions about autoimmunity, and how to use functional medicine to balance your immune system and take charge of your health. My goal in this class is to give you a deeper understanding of what autoimmune disease is, what causes it, and how to address those causes using as natural an approach as possible so you can avoid unnecessary drugs and even surgery. I want to empower you with the strategies and tools you need to take control of your health and recover your vitality, with the same approaches I've used successfully in my clinic with hundreds of patients over the past 10 plus years. The class will run for about an hour, and it will be packed with evidence-based, practical information that you can put to use right away. Go to kresser.co/autoimmuneclass. That's kresser.co/autoimmuneclass to learn more and register. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. 18 months now into COVID, it's clear that ventilation and air filtration are two of the best strategies for preventing transmission and infection. In fact, a few months into the pandemic, I shared a simple formula for assessing the risk of becoming infected, which is the volume of viral particles times the length of exposure equals the amount of risk. So in an indoor environment, the volume of particles and length of exposure tend to be higher. So if you're in an enclosed space with no ventilation and there are several people who are infected, then there are going to be a lot of viral particles in the air, and people tend to spend, significant periods of time in rooms, whether they're working or, at home or what have you. So that's one reason why the risk of infection indoors is so much higher. There's data from a study that was published in The Lancet in September 2020 that shows that in indoor air without filtration, it can take weeks for aerosol viral particles to fall 5 feet to the ground. So this means that if someone visits your house and they have a high viral load and cough or sneeze, those particles may stay airborne for a really long time. So both ventilation and air filtration will affect the volume of particles you're exposed to and the length of exposure. Ventilation means that the particles are going to move out of your range of exposure more quickly, typically. So this is, of course, why being outdoors is so much safer than being indoors during the COVID pandemic. It's also why there have been so few cases and outbreaks associated with air travel. Airplanes happen to have very effective air filtration. So this is why the CDC, the EPA, and many other federal and international agencies recommend ventilation and air purification as strategies for protecting against infection. But unfortunately, most buildings in the U.S., whether their homes or businesses, have poor ventilation and weak or even non-existent filtration. You can open the windows in your house, of course, but that isn't very practical if you live, let's say, in Chicago in the winter, or many climates, in fact. And winter is the season when COVID is most likely to be surging. So last year, right around this time, I recorded a podcast episode with Mike Schrantz, who is an indoor environmental professional and an expert in these topics. And we discussed the ins and outs of ventilation and air filtration, particularly in the home. So given that we're approaching winter again here in the Northern Hemisphere and we're still dealing with COVID, I decided to re-release this episode so that folks who didn't get a chance to hear it, or maybe even those that did, can hear it again, because ventilation and filtration are as important as they've ever been, maybe even more so, and this information is still highly relevant. So in the episode, Mike and I didn't recommend any specific air filters, but I've gotten a lot of questions from you folks as listeners, and then also people on my email list and social media channels about which air filter I do recommend, because there are a lot of options on the market, and I think there's a lot of confusion as well about what makes a good air filter and which ones are the best options. So after the interview with Mike, I do share my top pick for an air filter that you can buy for your home or workplace or any other indoor environment that you're spending a significant amount of time in. So make sure to catch that if you're interested at the end of the episode. All right, so let's dive into this interview from last year with Mike Schrantz. Mike is the founder and operator of Environmental Analytics. He has over 20 years of experience in improving indoor air quality and building science. And the first podcast that I did with Mike, we talked about indoor air quality in the context of mold and other biotoxins that you might encounter from water damage. That's a big issue that's, of course, been around for really as long as we've had buildings, but certainly an uptick in mold biotoxin-related illness in the past couple of decades. In this show, I wanted to talk with Mike about changes that we might be able to make to our home to reduce our exposure to viral load during the COVID pandemic. And all through the pandemic, I've talked about the risk of infection being a product of the volume of viral exposure multiplied by time. And so anything we can do to reduce that volume of viral exposure is a good thing. And we're going to be spending a lot more time inside, most of us, as the fall and winter months approach. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about some things we can do to reduce that viral load exposure during the season to come. So without further delay, I give you Mike Schrantz. Mike, pleasure to have you back on the show.
Chris, thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to jump right in here. COVID is on everybody's mind, of course, and we are heading into the fall winter season where in most places, I know in Tucson, Arizona, this may not be true, but it starts to get cold and flu season is approaching. People are worried about a spike in COVID infections. People are going to be spending a lot more time indoors. And all through this pandemic, I've been saying that the risk of infection is a product of volume of exposure to viral particles multiplied by time. So I want to talk to you about how we can reduce the volume of exposure to viral particles in our homes and perhaps in other indoor environments. If someone's a small business owner or rents an office somewhere or has some control over that indoor environment, how can we actually approach this indoor air quality issue so that we can create the healthiest living spaces that we can through this winter and beyond, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that mechanical ventilation or even natural ventilation is a big topic. We can dive into that one obviously deeper. Filtration is going to be another successful way. And there's a little bit of stuff coming out about purification, which I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more on in terms of the differences between, you hear terms that are interchangeable to certain people. Purification, isn't that filtration? Well, technically, no. When we're filtering something out, we're removing it, we're filtering it. If we're purifying it, we're adding some sort of technology. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential improvements. Probably the top two to me are going to definitely be filtration and some form of ventilation, which, as you indicated in the beginning, might be good for somebody like myself in Tucson, Arizona, where we can just open up a front window and a back sliding glass door, but that doesn't do much for people in the colder climates.
Right. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about ventilation. I wrote an email a few weeks ago and did an Instagram video about the importance of ventilation. And this turns out to be one of the biggest factors influencing the risk of acquiring COVID. And of course, this is why outdoor activity has been, one of the main recommendations throughout the summer months, because that's a very well ventilated environment. That's the best kind of ventilation you're going to get. So even if you're standing relatively close to someone and they're infected and they're, talking or even singing or shouting, the viral particles that are emitted will disperse fairly quickly and become diffused in that outside air. And it's interesting to me how in the mainstream media, there's not actually a lot of discussion about ventilation in indoor environments and that as a potential modifiable risk factor. I've seen it in some stories about airplanes and how air travel has been surprisingly safe until you understand how well purified the air is, and how ventilated the air is in an airplane. There's a change of air every 2 to 3 minutes in most airplanes. So yeah, what are the key factors for ventilation? Maybe starting with, how does someone even know whether their house has good or poor ventilation?
Uh, uh, Using an air conditioning company or somebody who is certified to do what's called blower door testing. There's an organization, and there's a couple of them out there, but Building Performance Institute is an example of an organization that can come out to your home and do pressure testing. We don't know how leaky or tight your home is. And there are rules of thumb. If the house is built prior to the energy crisis on the edge of the late 60s and early 70s, you might be what's classically defined as having a leakier home, and the opposite is true as you get into the more recent times where houses are being built extremely tight, which means they're not getting a lot of natural ventilation, stuff that's coming through the cracks, the crevices, and that sort of thing. So numerically, if you don't know where you're at and you're trying to get an idea of is my house poorly ventilated, it really starts with working with a professional company who can come out and do that type of testing, or else it really is kind of just guesswork.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you said, general rule of thumb, more recent houses are actually have poorer ventilation, which is interesting, because I mean that is good from an energy efficiency standpoint, right? So you're going to have less heat escaping or air conditioning escaping, and it'll be better from an energy efficiency standpoint, which is why the newer houses are better sealed. But there was a kind of unintended consequence there with those better sealed houses.
And never has that been more true than on the topic we're dealing with today. It is an inverse relationship holistically. The energy crisis led the way. Tighter homes, lower utility bills, all of that good stuff is certainly attractive, but it comes at a consequence, and usually with indoor air quality. And I won't go 8 levels deep here, but there were chronic exposures. People were starting to feel weird, feel bad, sick building syndrome, you name it.
Mold,
newer homes are going to be an
VOCs,
issue.
all that stuff, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So testing is the first step.
Yeah, we just had one of these tests, local company in Utah. And a lot of times these energy efficiency companies that, where their business is to do upgrades for improved energy efficiency, will do a blower door test for free, as a way of helping you to kind of assess what needs to be done. And sometimes local utilities will do them as well. Like our local utility offers credits, and if you have a leaky house, here we've talked about leaky gut on this show, leaky brain, leaky skin, now we're leaky lung, now we're talking about leaky house. If you have a leaky house, putting some money towards those upgrades, and sometimes can get you a energy credit. But you have to balance that, as we've discussed, Mike, where in our case, our house is probably so leaky that even if we do some sealing, we still are not going to be in that tight house, where it becomes a health threat area. So it's kind of where a homeowner has to assess, what their goals are, and then, where they're starting from, where they want to get to.
One of the to go along with what you're saying, one of the issues I ran across in the research, take for example the airplane example of ventilation, and I'm familiar with that. What a lot of people don't know that are listening is that that's primarily based off of occupancy. So when you slam 150 people in a 737 aircraft in a relatively small vessel, they're compensating to improve the indoor air quality by changing the amount of fresh air that comes on. And that's why literally when you look at other things like commercial buildings, schools, you're going to see higher guidelines for ventilation, air changes per hour, or ACH is the term. But when you look at residences, you'll notice that the requirements all of a sudden fall off, and all of a sudden now it's like, 0.35 to maybe on the upper end, as just an example, 1 air change per hour. And people are getting all the data mixed up because they're like, well, can I just make my house 6
Right.
air
2 to
changes per
3
hour,
changes per hour. Yeah.
and you can't
Not,
do
you don't
that.
need to live in a clean room.
No,
Yeah. Yeah. If you got a 2,000 square foot house and a family of four, that's fundamentally different concentration of people per square foot than in an airplane, right? That's
exactly.
fairly obvious. So, and obviously less, carbon dioxide and other stuff being emitted. So, all right. So let's say someone does a blower door test and they find that their house is very tight. Maybe they have a newer house, they have poor ventilation. What are some of the options then? And we can do this by climate. So let's say, as you said, if they're in a warm climate, the easiest low tech but effective option is just opening some windows, right?
Yeah, and I would argue, obviously, a preferred, and
Mm-hmm.
excluding the wildfire scenario or poor outdoor,
Right.
that whole thing,
Right.
that whole disclaimer put to the side, the amount of air changes you can get on a nice day through your home is going to arguably be more than the realistic mechanical ventilation.
Wow,
Just to clarify.
especially, yeah, if you have cross breeze. Yeah,
Yep.
so maybe if you live in an apartment in Shanghai, you probably shouldn't open your window, right? But
Right.
if you're in a place with relatively good air quality, that's the number one. And yeah, maybe people will be willing to do that even when it's pretty cool outside, as a trade-off from the potential of having a home where the ventilation is poor and viral particles might be higher versus putting on a sweater and having the heat on maybe a little bit less. I don't know. All right, so then if someone's not in, someone lives, let's say, in Minnesota or Chicago,
There
and
you go.
opening a window is just not even feasible, what are the options there?
If we're talking about, of course, I'm anxious to tell you about other alternatives, but on the topic of mechanical or ventilation in general, you're going to be looking at probably mechanical ventilation. Mechanical ventilation is when you have a dedicated device that is bringing in outdoor air, hopefully filtering it to some level of minimum efficiency. You'll see it's not uncommon for some nicer units to have a MERV 11 or a MERV 13 filter,
Right.
and then ultimately injecting that fresh filtered. And if you're running it through an energy recovery ventilator or a heating recovery ventilator, depending on your climate, you'll be transferring energy from the air. So in plain English, if you have cold outdoor air, this device is designed to also exhaust out warmer air from the inside, thus warming in the incoming air. Here's the
Right.
challenge. You can't just go out to your local air conditioning supply house and buy because most people are of the thought of, if a little's good, more is better.
Right.
And you can't buy some oversized mechanical ventilation device that dumps in too much air, because if your heating, we're using the winter as the example,
Right.
if your heater can't keep up with that load,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden you're going to run into a couple of issues, one of which is comfort. It'll be
Right.
freezing cold in the house, and
Right.
but by golly, you got that monster unit. So I try not to
Yeah.
overplug this disclaimer, but every time you talk about installing a device, everyone needs to assume that they need to bring in a professional who understands ASHRAE guidelines, which is an organization that establishes ventilation guidelines for residential and commercial sectors, and have them look to see what is the maximum amount, what's the appropriate amount of mechanical ventilation that your particular home can receive.
Right. Right. All right. So, or you could just like poke a few holes in your wall, or pull
Sounds
out
like
your weather
natural ventilation again.
pull out your weather stripping under the doors and windows, and um, pretend you have an older house. So that's ventilation is key, and there are various options for dealing with it, as we just mentioned. And those are going to vary depending on your climate, when your house was built, what your current uh, status is as assessed by the blower door test. Let's talk a little bit, or anything else to say about ventilation before we move on to purification, because I think there's quite a few options there that we should cover.
Yeah, I think with mechanical ventilation, it just boils down to understanding that not getting caught up in. We'd love for your house to be a clean room where you have a laminar flow of air coming through, because that would be the ultimate dilution technique. But that's not realistic. your goal is going to be working in concert with a bunch of other things. This is just one component. You get the optimal amount of either natural ventilation or mechanical ventilation your home can take, and then you do other things, which we're about to talk about.
Great. All right, so let's move into this. And again, the context here is we're trying to reduce the viral load exposure. So, why are we talking about this? Well, let's say a scenario where you have to have a repair person come to your house. You have no idea what they're, and maybe they don't even they have COVID-19, and they're in your house for a few hours. Well, ideally, you'd want to have some kind of mechanism for filtering and purifying that air so that your exposure to that viral load would be lower. Or let's even say one of the family members gets infected, and in most cases, the family member that's infected will be semi-isolated. Maybe they live in their bedroom for a little while to prevent infecting other people, but obviously they're still breathing, air circulating around the house. Their bedroom's not completely hermetically sealed from the rest of the house. So this is another way of purifying the air, or reducing that viral load exposure for anyone that happens to be in the house that might be infected, whether they know it or not. So air purification and filtration. So let's first talk about, you kind of briefly mentioned the difference between filtration and purification, but maybe you could give some examples of like commercial examples that are out there, like the difference between a filter and a purifier, and then which you would use in what situation, what are the pros and cons of each?
Sure. So filtration first, make no mistake about it, until additional research comes out, it'll probably be the safer go-to for those listening. And here's why. Filtration is the physical removal of an airborne contaminant. And, we've learned a lot. There is so much information online. You can only imagine. Well, I'm sure you can. In terms of, the average size of the virus, depending on what you see, is about a tenth of a micron. But then it comes out in respiratory droplets, so they may be bigger. And it's all this stuff that leads into what is an appropriate filter that could, can you scrub the air physically to remove or lower the concentration, so that people have a better chance of not getting infected. And filtration is a proven technology. It's been around for over a century. I'll give you a couple quick nuggets here. What you can find when you read, whether it's from the CDC, the EPA, or both of those organizations that will reference ASHRAE, which again can establish a lot of information, including giving you information on filter efficiencies. They'll recommend things like MERV filters that are somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 to 14. So this idea of having you have an air conditioner, let's say it's whether it's an air handler, a furnace, and it can do heating and cooling. You have a filter on that. And they're recommending as guidelines to use a MERV 13 or higher, but there's this huge caveat, like in big bold letters, that basically is saying you need to make sure that your system can handle it. If you slap a big filter that's overly resistant in your system because you think if MERV 14 is good, MERV 16 might be better, which you would be right in that sense, your system may not be able to handle the resistance. So filtration, a lot of times what we're recommending for people who especially don't have more robust systems, and one way for them to find out whether their system can handle higher MERV rated filters is, of course, going to an air conditioning company who knows how to measure that, is to bring in portable filtration devices. And I'm happy to give a couple of name examples, but there is a commercial unit that I actually have in my son's bedroom that it provides hyper HEPA filtration, so much higher than MERV 16, and really able to scrub the air. And just to do some quick math with you, his room is getting about 8 to 12 air changes per hour, filtered changes of air. To lower it is a great way and is well documented and supported by the CDC and the EPA to filter the air out, to lower those concentrations in combination with natural or mechanical ventilation when you can. Now, there's obviously a couple of exceptions there, but that's the primary thing.
Yeah, as you know, there's a lot of marketing hype out there with filters and purifiers, and I think it's really difficult for the average, buyer to be able to sift through that and really know what's legit and what's not.
Fair
So,
enough. What you're going to get for these higher end models is a higher sense of confidence that they're going to filter out particles at the marketed or advertised
right,
specifications, because they have the science, they have the money to have done that.
Independent third-party verification.
Exactly, that's key, because everyone they're hiding behind words like HEPA-like or HEPA-type, and you're paying what you think is good money for true HEPA, but you're not getting it. Those are two examples that work really well. And I'll tell you, I had a particle counter in my son's room when I first installed it. And again, this is not exactly a laboratory setting, but take a room that's 10 foot by 14 feet in dimensions, 8.5 foot ceilings. In less than 20 minutes, I was able to get that 0.3 micron size particle, 24% of the outdoors as a comparison, which is extremely good. HEPA is going to offer you better filtration, much better filtration than a MERV 16. However, MERV 16 is pretty good too. And one thing, a quick piece of information that's useful. If you look at a graph of a filter and how it's able to remove its efficiency or performance at any particular particle size, typically the particle sizes that we're looking at, you hear people saying, oh, it's 99.97% efficient at 0.3 microns. Whether you have a MERV 16 or a MERV 14, the size of the virus and even some of the suspected particle sizes that virus might be attached to is going to have better filtration than the 0.3 rating. So in other words, you're actually getting a little bit better filtration than you think you do for any given filter. But most people, Chris, don't have the access or the ability to run a MERV 16. In your case, that Perfect 16 is a great option because you had the physical room to install what was a large box of banks of filters to get it down to that rating.
Right. And the advantage also to the portable filter is so you just mentioned that got it down to 23% of the outdoor value in 20 minutes. So in theory, you could have the filter in the kitchen during the day or the living room or another or home office or living space like that, and then take that up half hour before your kid goes to bed and put it in there, right?
Yeah, all other things being constant, one of which is doors and windows shut. You can't filter the air if your doors and windows open. You're not going to get that type of differential. And of course, a leakier home is going to be harder to filter out and get those lower numbers than a tighter home. But yes, in general, obviously, because another part of this topic is, okay, fine. So we hear what the audience is hearing is that whole house filtration is definitely something to look at. Work with your air conditioning company to make sure that you're not over installing something that's too resistant. But portable filtration devices are a quick, easy way to get superior filtration. The next question that always comes up is, well, how many? Because you've seen this, right, online. It's like, this unit, good for up to 1,500 square feet. Based off of what metric? Somebody with COVID? It's based off of perfect mixing.
Are the doors open? Are they closed?
That's right.
How sealed is the house, etc.
There's a rule of thumb that I finally was able to find that comes from ultimately like infection and control and all that. And it's a crude number, but it's a good one. And the argument was for the area that you're trying to filter, if you can get greater than or equal to 12 air filter changes per hour, that's kind of a good keep it clean environment. So if you think about that, I did some quick math before we got on, and if you take an average room, 10 foot by 10 foot with 8.5 foot ceilings, and you say, okay, that's 850 cubic feet, and then you say times 12, because that's how many air changes you'd want to have in an hour, and you do the arithmetic of how much CFM, how many cubic feet per minute do I need to filter in order to get 12, the number would come out to 170. Again, that assumes perfect mixing, which there's not. But here's the idea is most of these higher end or even medium level portable filtration units will get you 170 cubic feet per minute for in that scenario. So these are very attainable options for people to get superior filtration.
Cool. That's really helpful because that is a big question that comes up a lot. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of other um, options now that fall into the category of air purification. And so there are ozone based units, ultraviolet, a bunch of other technologies that are coming on the market. Some companies now are combining purification with filtration in the same unit. So, what's your take on purification? Does that have any additional benefit above and beyond filtration? If you have a great unit, should you even be considering purification? Is there any situation where you would consider purification in lieu of filtration? Yeah, so let's break that all down.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's here's the thing with purification. I'm reminded of some of the concerns I've always had about purification pre-COVID. There was always general concerns about byproducts or what's called technically intermediates that can be created, basically the incomplete destruction of a particular contaminant in the air with these purification devices like UV light, ozone. You've heard, many of you, of hydroxyl radicals. Um,
Yeah.
there's nothing that I was able to find, Chris, that shows, number one, superior performance to break down COVID, or at least the virus that creates COVID, in a reasonable time or in a reasonable environment. And here's what I mean: you have some companies that are working with uh, different commercial, like airlines, where they will push a UV system, an empty plane, through the aisle of a plane and have high doses of UVC to kill, and based off of the intensity and time that you're saturating a given surface with, there's been studies that would show that that's effective at killing. But that doesn't really help you out in a residential home for a couple of reasons. First of all, you're not going to buy the device to do that. Second of all, there's exposure concerns. Ozone is a respiratory, at minimum, a respiratory concern at levels that can actually kill. Same with UV light. There is a newer technology that they're looking at. There's two forms of UV light. That's where it seems a lot of attention right now with purification is going. One UVC option are ceiling mounted or high wall mounted devices that shine the UV towards the ceiling. But you're seeing this more in commercial applications, not necessarily residential homes. You can imagine walking into your friend's house and there's these random lights that are shining upwards. There's an issue of how much dwell time does the virus need to be exposed to that virus. The bottom line is it's not well known yet. There's a UVC stream called far UVC, which is the 222 nanometers emission or wavelength. They're looking at that right now, Chris, this idea that you could actually turn this device on in your home or in restaurants and be exposed to it. And because of the wavelength, there's under certain, as long as it meets other parameters, it's not going to be a exposure concern. But all of this stuff is tip of the spear. There hasn't been decades worth of, you know, consensus that purification would work. I think what it boils down to is qualitatively, okay? Qualitatively, we understand that purification techniques can work, but you're asking about quantitatively. I know this thing can kill a virus. How much of it can it kill? If the average sneeze or cough throws out anywhere from 500 to 20,000 virons of this virus, you know, how well of a job is it going to do? So what I would invite the listeners to consider is, you know, user beware, do your research, look up the technologies, see what sort of independent third-party studies that they have are showing to report performance of these units, and what are the possible side effects. The EPA has a document right along the same document or page that you'd find online for their recommendations, I should say the EPA, for residential homes, and it gets you a link right to that paper. And they're
Mm-hmm.
concerned about what they don't know about the technology before they have a bunch of people going out and start buying it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there are a number of technologies which may be promising,
Yeah.
but the data aren't quite there yet, and there are some concerns. So it seems to me that if there's certainly no additional proven benefit of purification beyond filtration, then doesn't really seem to make sense to mess with that too much at this
Well,
point.
and I think to me that Chris, the truth is it's the unknown risk, because I would argue that in favor of UV light if it was an unoccupied building.
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies the point: is we're not talking about what do we do with our homes when we're not living in them. We're talking
Right.
about being exposed to them. And the other part of it too is, because people thought, well, we've heard about adding UV light in the ductwork, and again, there are applications where putting a UV light by the evaporator coil in a humid climate could be a great way to minimize microbial growth. We're not talking about microbial growth right now, but that would be a great way to minimize that under certain conditions and considerations. But if you think about dwell time is the amount of time predicted to need to kill the virus or damage it so that it can't replicate in your body. That's the important part here. It's
Yeah.
not it's not short seconds. It's typically minutes. And when you have a viron, a particle that has the virus in it, that's flying through the ductwork at somewhere between 400 and 700 feet per minute, if you do the math in your head, it's not getting minutes of exposure. It might get a second, depending on
Right.
where the bulb's at. So this is what I mean is I'd like to talk about it more like if you were a family member, what would be the great ways to improve the overall indoor air quality of the home, and beyond following by far the CDC, EPA, World Health Organization, which are all pretty much in line with washing your hands and proper PPE. It would be filtration and mechanical or natural ventilation. Those would be
Great.
the top items.
Great. So just want to say something that maybe goes without saying, but want to kind of highlight it because we didn't really mention this too much in the beginning. All the steps that we're talking about are not just going to be helpful for COVID protection. They are going to also be helpful for just improving indoor air quality overall and improving health overall, because we know from so much research now that indoor air quality is, improving indoor air quality is one of the most important things we can do to improve our health and protect against disease. But it's one of the last things that I think people tend to think about. So this is an opportunity and maybe a greater source of motivation with this acute COVID crisis, but any steps that you take to improve your indoor air quality will be valuable, well beyond the lifetime of the COVID pandemic.
Absolutely. This conversation, and ironically, a lot of the staple solutions that we're talking about today stem from other sorts of contaminants and exposures that we've been dealing with for decades. We know that they work. We know that they present minimal exposure issues. And the other part, and this comes up a lot, is it's like you said, whether it's a temperature issue or it's an issue of wildfires. I've heard there's a few going on right now in California, as an
Oh
example.
boy, yeah.
Is mechanical ventilation or natural ventilation may not be an option, right? I mean, you might literally notice an adverse condition by leaving that window open one day. That's why you need to arm yourself with all these other things so that they can work in concert with each other. This idea of added filtration, portable devices, I think somewhere between 150 and greater, that are going to be in a price range you can afford, and stick one in your bedroom, stick one in your living room, and know that, okay, on a day that I'm going to just open up my doors and my windows and get ample outdoor air. By the way, I'm looking forward to that in Tucson. I'm not going to run that filtration device and waste its energy and time, because I'm just filtering the world. But I know that when I close my house up, now I have the ability to turn this filtration unit on, and that, along with good clean habits, washing my hands, trying not to be up in front of everybody's face who visits my house, all those sorts of things are going to be, these are the low-hanging fruit options of minimizing exposure in the long run.
Yeah, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is what you're saying here.
Exactly.
There's the sort of superior premier models, but then there are other models that are also way better than not having any filtration at all. And as
Exactly.
long and Are there any like rating sites or organizations? You mentioned a few organizations that are more related to like ventilation, but any kind of places that rank air filters, or what standard should people really be looking for? Is there kind of a minimum MERV value
Oh,
that you want to see, below which it doesn't really make sense to use that device?
golly, any filtration is going to be better than no filtration, assuming it's still a good working filter. Even a MERV 8 filter or a MERV 6 that offers relatively poor performance doesn't mean it doesn't offer any. What I would recommend for people who are looking at air filtration that deals with their air conditioning systems, so we're talking whole house filtration, is to work with your local air conditioning company to find a way to install a MERV 13 or higher based off of what is coming out of the ASHRAE recommendations and suggestions based off of the curves on what they're able to remove at these given particle sizes. MERV 14 seems to be really the ideal target, but don't sweat it if your unit can't handle it. If you're in a very financial tough spot or there's not the physical room to install these types of upgrades, you also have portable filtration, which we spent some time talking about. That is really a great option. In fact, in some cases, it might be the preferred option over marginally improving what may be a MERV 6 filter right now in your system to a MERV 8. This information is coming from independent studies from filtration studies. The EPA and the CDC are smart not to specify things specific because they're afraid people will abuse it and not understand that it's complicated. You can't just slap in a nice filter. But I think if you could do a combination of what we've been talking about today, you're going to be eons better than the majority of people that are in less fortunate situations.
Yeah, so we had a previous podcast where we talked a lot more about filtration and indoor air quality in the context of mold and other biotoxins that you might encounter in the indoor environment. So for folks that are interested in that, just Google Kresser, Mike Schrantz, Revolution Health Radio, and that should pop right up, or we'll put the link in the show notes as well that you can check out on the website. And Mike, thanks again for coming back on the show. I think this is a really interesting way that we can reduce our exposure, reduce our risk over these winter months, especially when we're going to be spending more time indoors. It's probably not on a lot of people's radar. So, and I always appreciate your expertise in these areas.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Send in your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question and stay healthy and well this winter. Okay, now that we've covered the basics on why improving the quality of indoor air is so important, I want to tell you which air filter I use myself and recommend to my patients, and to the doctors and coaches I train and my friends and family. But before I do that, I want to cover some of the most important variables to consider when you're choosing an air filter. So the first is the number of air changes per hour. I talked about this with Mike in the podcast, but experts recommend cleaning the air at 5 times per hour or 1 air change every 12 minutes for maximum effectiveness. Again, as a side note, airplanes, they do even better with a change of air every 2 to 3 minutes. And I think that explains why air travel hasn't been associated with significant outbreaks despite people sitting close together for long periods. So that's how important the number of changes of air per hour can be. How often an air purifier can clean the air is a function of how much air it moves and the size of the space it's in. You really need to pay attention to this because some air purifiers or manufacturers of air filters and purifiers claim that their products can change the air 5 times an hour, but when you look at the fine print, you see that that's only true in like 100 square foot space. Or some companies might claim that their filter can clean a 2,500 square foot area, but at that size of a room, it will only be 1 change of air in an hour, which isn't enough. The second factor is a little easier to understand, and that's just how effective the purifier is at removing potentially harmful particles from the air. And this can include things like particulate matter, you would find in air pollution, mold, bacteria, and of course viruses. And some of these particles, like viruses, can be really, really small. So it's crucial that the purifier can remove those as well. The third factor is whether the purifier also captures toxic volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. A lot of the cheaper HEPA filters don't do this, but I think it's crucial because these compounds can cause serious issues for some people. The fourth factor is noise. Some air filters are really loud, sounds like an airplane taking off or something. And I'm particularly noise sensitive, so having one that operates quietly is essential for me. The fifth factor is cost, and in particular, cost relative to effectiveness, because even the cheapest air filter, if you pay like $75, if it doesn't work, that's a wasted $75. So we can't just look at price, we have to look at cost effectiveness. And this can be measured with air filters with the metric cost per CADR, or clean air delivery rate. CADR is a metric used to measure the effectiveness of air filters. So if we take cost as a function of CADR, that can give us some more insight into just how cost effective an air filter is. All right, so with all of that in mind, my pick is the Air Doctor group of filters. So let's see how they stack up against my criteria. Their most popular product is the Air Doctor 3000, and that cleans the air once every 12 minutes or 5 times per hour in a 500 square foot room. They have also a product for smaller spaces, the Air Doctor 1000, which cleans the air 5 times an hour in a 235 square foot room. And then for larger spaces like a living room or a great room, the Air Doctor 5000 cleans the air 5 times an hour in an approximately 870 square foot room. In terms of effectiveness, it's tough to beat the Air Doctor. It filters 100% of airborne particles as small as 0.003 microns in size, and that makes it 100 times more effective than typical HEPA filters. And in an independent third-party lab test, the Air Doctor removed 99.99% of a test group of 11 bacteria and viruses. So that's obviously very important in the world that we live in today, especially. As far as gases like volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, Air Doctor's dual action carbon gas trap VOC filter captures toxic VOCs. And these could be like VOCs from off-gassing furniture, building materials, paint, carpet, household cleaning products, and even formaldehyde and ozone. Air Doctors are super quiet. I've used a lot of air filters and purifiers over the years, and I find that the Air Doctor is the least obtrusive that I have used. It's not just that they're 30% quieter than standard HEPA filters, which they are, but it's the pitch or the quality of the noise, I think, that makes an even bigger difference. Some of the other air filters, like I said, they kind of rattle around and sound like a plane is taking off, or they have this really high-pitched whine that just drives me nuts. But Air Doctors are just kind of almost like a white noise, just fades into the background really easily. Finally, Air Doctors are extremely cost-effective. I think they're probably the most cost-effective filter on the market. Some other filters have a cost per CADR ranging from $5 to $8. For the Air Doctor 3000, which is their most popular unit, it's about $1.50. So that is between 3 and 5 times more cost-effective than other filters, that people tend to buy. So it's clearly a much better deal, and it's even lower if you take advantage of the discount I'm about to mention. So I've worked out a special group buying discount for my community through Air Doctor. You can save up to $300 off the retail price, which is nearly half off of the Air Doctor 3000. And they also offer payment plans with a company called Affirm that have payments as low as $30 a month, which can be a good option for some people. So to learn more about these filters and take advantage of this offer, go to kresser.co/airdoctor, all one word, Air Doctor. I have a few filters in different rooms in my house. I love how fresh and clean the air smells, and I love the peace of mind that they give me. As many of you know, we lived in a house with serious mold issues many years ago, and it caused really significant harm to my family's health, to all three of us. And since then, I've been very serious about maintaining indoor air quality. And of course, in the world that we live in today, I'm happy to know I have air filters that capture 99.99% of the bacterial and viral particles that were tested. And that's especially true as we're moving into the winter, and I'll be spending more time indoors. So again, go to kresser.co/airdoctor to check these out and pick one up. And I hope this was helpful and leads to cleaner air for you and your family. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser.L.Ac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.